So, can we start by learning a bit about yourself, like when you were born and where you were born, where you grew up?
Okay, I was born in August of 1947 at Fort Knox, where my father was stationed. He was in the Army. I have a brother and a sister, and we, for the first 15 or so years of my life, we traveled to different Army posts, from California to Alaska to Virginia, Pennsylvania, all over the country.
So, you traveled all over the United States or all over the world as a
We
kid?
never got to go overseas. We always stayed in the United States. So, yeah, but we lived a lot of different places in the States.
So, it must have been a pretty interesting childhood, although you probably had to move schools a lot, right? So, you had a pretty non-traditional.
Yeah, I think I counted one time. By the time I was in eighth grade, I had been in 13 schools.
Oh, wow. Was that hard or was that?
I think it made you very resilient. I think that you learned to go into a new situation and evaluate it, even as a child. You know, you saw who was going to be a troublemaker. You saw who might be fun, who you might like to have as a friend. And I think that was a good basis for life, basically. I
Yeah.
always laugh at people who are so upset that their children are going to move 15 minutes away. Boo hoo. I can't relate to that.
Nope, can't relate, right? And so, how did you end up in Maryland? And you currently live where exactly?
Well, my father's last posting was at Fort Lee, Virginia. They moved to my parents' hometown of Altoona, Pennsylvania, but because of my mother's health, they decided they would move back to the DC area so that she could be near Walter Reed, where she'd had a lot of treatment before. So we moved to Silver Spring, and from eighth grade on, I was through college, through the University of Maryland. I lived in the Silver Spring, Tacoma Park area for the most part.
And then that's where you've been staying for the past few decades now, right?
Well, I was, that's kind of home, but I've lived in Baltimore for 30 some years. So it's changed so much. When I go back, I almost have to get a map to know where I'm going.
I know, stuff can change so much in just a few years.
Oh my goodness, it's amazing.
And so, can you tell me a bit about your family members or a member who experienced the war, like their occupation, how they got into?
The actual war victim, I guess you would call, although he probably didn't think of himself as a victim, was my father, because he was a young Army officer sent to the Philippines in the summer of 1941. That was basically 6 months before Pearl Harbor. So he was in overseas from then on, and he was caught up when the war started in the battles. He was an infantryman, and he was in charge of Philippine Scouts. Now, the Philippine Scouts were an American Army unit. They were the best trained army that the Philippines had. They didn't have much of a Philippine army at the time because no one had really brought their defenses up to snuff, and MacArthur was brought back to do that. So my father was an American American officer with Filipino enlisted men.
Oh, that's interesting. So, how did he first get involved in the military or the army?
I have a picture of him when he's about 4 years old, wearing a World War I uniform. It's really cute. So evidently the seed was planted early, but during his high school years in the mid-30s, he went for 2 or 3 years to Fort Meade from Altoona and went to a summer camp that was called CMTC, which was Civilian Military Training Camp. And he was in a Signal Corps unit, and he got a prize for being the best prepared and the best something else he got. But he was, he got a prize, a medal or something for being a good soldier. So after he graduated, there was not much opportunity. It was still the Depression. So there wasn't much opportunity for a good job. I know he drove trucks for a while. I think he worked at a grocery store. None of them were very satisfying. So he and his brother, Chuck, who was 4 years older, decided that they would go out to California. His one sister was already there. But meanwhile, because their father had been an employee of the Pennsylvania Railroad, they had railroad passes. So even though they were pretty poor, their family could travel. So he went from Altoona down to San Antonio, where his mother was staying for a while with his sister and her husband, who was in the Army, in the medical corps. And they stayed there for a while. And the only reason I know all this is because he has the pictures to prove it, you know. So then after the stay in San Antonio, he went to San Francisco, where his sister probably was at that time. And he joined the Army Air Corps, which was the forerunner of the present day Air Force. It was part of the Army at the time. And he joined the Army Air Corps in Sausalito at, oh my God, blanked out on that, Hamilton Field. He and his brother joined at Hamilton Field. And my father was working for an X-ray unit, so he was attached to the hospital. His brother actually got to fly planes, and we have a picture of a plane that he cracked up, supposedly. I don't think he was injured, but the plane was. So he was in medical administration again. He started out there. And at some point he was transferred to Stockton Field, which is in the middle of the state. And I don't have a lot of information from that part of his stay. I've tried. I can't find much, or a few pictures from him, but nothing official. But at that point, he was sent to the Philippines. He was made an officer. He was an enlisted man at Hamilton Field and at Stockton. Then he was made an officer, second lieutenant, and he was sent to the Philippines on June 1st. He was on the USS Pierce, and he went to Manila. Fort McKinley was right outside, and that's where he was based and that's where the Philippine Scouts were. There were a couple different units there. His brother stayed in the States and became an administrator of a school for bad boys, but then he was called back into the Army. But my father was in the Philippines for, as I said, about 6 months before the war started. So he was in it for good.
Yeah. So you mentioned that funny little anecdote about your dad being dressed in like a World War I uniform when he was like only a toddler. So were your grandparents also like in the Army or so?
Oh no! Oh my gosh, no! My grandmother wouldn't let my father play football because she was afraid that her baby would get hurt. He was the youngest of 12 children, and he was the one. Oh shoot, I don't have it. I thought I had the picture, but so she did not want him to play football. So of course she certainly didn't want him in the Army, but that's what he did. He wanted to be in the Army.
And then your grandfather was the same way?
He had died in 1939 while my father was and his brother were in California, and they could not get back for the funeral.
Oh.
Yeah, he had cancer, and they were expecting it, so it wasn't a total shock.
Yeah, still sad nonetheless.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so since your father found himself in the Philippines like a few months before the war started, so how did he end up getting captured and becoming a prisoner of war?
Well, he was in Manila and the war started, and the war plan was that all of the Army troops would go into Bataan, which was a peninsula across Manila Bay from Manila. So they had to go up and back down into the peninsula. So that's what they did. All the Army units kept coming back from doing different positions that they held. This was all in the plan. And then eventually all the troops were gathered on the Bataan Peninsula or on Corregidor Island. And he went to Bataan, and he was with headquarters company of the 45th Infantry Philippine Scouts. And in the archives, I found a couple references to I found a diary that made a reference to my father. The author and my father were hiding in the culvert outside headquarters when the bombs started. You have to understand that when Pearl Harbor was bombed, within hours after that, the Japanese bombed the Philippines. They bombed Clark Field, wiped out our Air Force. Then they bombed Manila and Corregidor, I believe, a little bit. And they also wiped out Hong Kong, Singapore, Wake, Guam. They bombed all these places simultaneously. So it was a huge disaster all at once. So my father was in the fighting. And as an officer in a medical administration, I have the feeling that he stayed with headquarters a lot. But there is one reference in one of those diaries that the author traded places with Burkhart, and Burkhart went to the front. So, and the other clue is that on January 24th, 1942, he was written up for a Silver Star for going out on the battlefield under heavy artillery fire to save the life of a Filipino troop, one of his men, that was, I found out later, was the radio operator. And he went out to try to save Sergeant Sagoin. And that's when he was written up for the Silver Star. So we know he was in battle then. And then his unit went to the west side of the peninsula. Most of the Japanese attack was down the east side of the peninsula. His unit got sent in a lot for backup and to try to fill holes where Filipino units had disintegrated and or were just beaten. But when they heard that there was going to be a surrender, because there was no place else to go, they were almost down at the end of the peninsula, General King decided that he would surrender, and he thought he'd be court-martialed because MacArthur had given them orders that they were not to surrender. And he didn't tell Jonathan Wainwright, who was on Corregidor. He just did it because he did not want his troops slaughtered. So they heard King was going to surrender, and they always say to this day, the former POWs, we were surrendered. We did not surrender. So they were not happy that they were surrendered. But anyway, when he heard that, he was halfway up the west side of Bataan Peninsula, and he had an attack of malaria. So he decided that he would go to hospital number 1, which was not too far from the tip of the bottom southern tip of the peninsula. So somehow he got himself a number of miles around and up to the hospital. So he spent from the April 9th surrender until May 1st in that hospital. He did not do the death march. He was a very lucky man, and his decision, or the attack of malaria, whichever could be counted as the real reason, that saved him from the death march. I believe that he saw the death march from the hospital because it was just off the road, and some of the Filipino patients were turned out by the Japanese and made to walk with fresh surgery wounds and broken legs and coming out of traction. They were made to walk, but they didn't do it to the Americans. They left the Americans in the hospital, and one of the reasons supposedly was that the Japanese general that came down with the guns to bomb Corregidor saw that the hospital had Japanese prisoners in there, and Japanese prisoners were treated just like the American prisoners. They were given good food, good treatment, and the general was impressed, so he did not bother the hospital. And then they took my father and some other people and trucked them up to San Fernando, where they were squashed into a very, very small boxcar. It was made for 8 horses or 40 men, but they put 100 men in there. And it was now this is after the Death March. The Death March people walked to San Fernando and then were put on these, in these boxcars. But the boxcars were so crowded that all they could do was stand up. Excuse me. And they all had dysentery, and they didn't get water or food. And so if some man would foul himself because he had dysentery, the man next to him was covered also. And then they had to get out of that and walk another 8 miles or so to the camp. Excuse me. Yeah, I have some. So the camp was miserable when it started. They had thousands and thousands of people, tens of thousands of people. And they separated the Filipinos on one side and the Americans on the other side. And there were only, on the American side, there were only 2 spigots that worked that could give water to these men. So they stood in line all day to get water, and then only to have to get back in line just about right away. But some of them would take multiple canteens for the people that were so sick, or, just taking turns getting water. And the food was just a rice ball and some green soup made out of weeds. And they just didn't get any food. And thousands of people died in that camp on the Filipino side and on the American side. So then later, a month later in June, the Americans were transferred to Cabanatuan. Meanwhile, Corregidor had surrendered, and those people went from Bilibid prison, which was turned into a hospital, Bilibid prison in Manila. Then they were transferred to Cabanatuan, and that's the first time that the Bataan guys and the Corregidors generally met. And the Corregidor people were just shocked to see the condition of the men from Bataan. They were just wraithed. I mean, they were so skinny, and most of them didn't have clothes or shoes or anything, any personal possession. So that was another camp that was bad. Then in November, he was put on a ship and spent a month in the hold of a ship with 1,500 other men. And they finally got to Moshi, Japan. And then he was taken to Tanagawa, which was a horrible camp again. And, he kept a list of the people he knew that died. And one of my friends who I met later, her father was on that list. So pretty sad. And then he got to Zensuji, which was on Shikoku, on the southeast side of Japan. And that was a decent camp by camp standards. And he was there from January 43 to June of 45. And then he was taken to a camp in the Japanese Alps, which is more on the western side, almost parallel to Tokyo. And he spent the last 3 months there. And that was up in the mountains. They had no winter clothes. It was, September when they were liberated, and they had been told here in August, here, plant these sweet potatoes. This is what you're going to live on. So anybody knows that you don't plant things in August and expect to have a crop. So, they knew they probably would not make it through that winter. So then he was liberated and came home to the United States.
So he spent the entire war moving from camp to camp?
Yeah, well, a lot of other people went to more camps than that, and a lot of other POWs had much worse experiences. I know a lot of men who were taken and put in mines. These mines were old mines that had been abandoned because they didn't think they were getting enough out of it. The POWs were taken to Japan mainly for labor, and they worked for a tiny amount of food, and the mines were terrible. They didn't have them shored up properly, and so what if an American got killed? Who cared? They were expendable. They were cheap slave labor. And other people worked in smelters and stevedore. They did stevedoring at the docks. They were treated much worse than my father, because my father was an officer. Rank has its privilege. And the enlisted men in general were treated much worse than my father was. And then there was a notorious camp where they interrogated people, and that was terrible. Anytime they'd have a flyer come down in the Pacific, they'd send him to the torture intelligence camp. So my father basically was a lucky guy.